For Chapter 4, Segment 4, we begin with nodes, connections, and conditioning. And for starters, nodes are the memory representations which are activated when the stimuli are presented in the real world. And going off nodes, the connections are the association between the nodes which vary in strength due to learning. And in order for a node to be activated, a CS has to be present. So when a CS is present, activation then travels down existing associations to activate other nodes. So these nodes can be activated in two ways, and one is when the items occur on the external world, and another is when a node is associated with another node which has already been activated. Then this relates to short-term memory and means of activations because of self-generated priming and retrieval-generated priming. So Wagner's SOP model stands for Standard Operating Procedure, sometimes Opponent Process, and this approach accepts the idea that a CS or a US node becomes activated when the stimulus is present in the real world. So the model assumes that activation has two levels of intensity, which both are illustrated in this figure. And this figure explains the chains of events. Once a node is in A1, it then proceeds to decay to A2, and from there it becomes inactive. Once a node is in A2, it must always become inactive before it can go back to A1, and it makes sense because the memory activated by a retrieval queue and put in A2 is never quite vivid as a real thing in A1. So when a CS and a US occur together on a conditioning trial, the strength of the association will frequently increase a little bit, and in the long run, the US becomes less and less effective, causing new increments in the conditioning because it was already expected not to be surprising. So in SOP, priming a stimulus puts the corresponding memory node in A2, which prevents it from going back to A1. So the most important factors from taking from SOP is that it explains the effects on time on conditioning and backward conditioning in which a US is presented before the CS. So SOP inhibition principle explains how inhibition is learned during a compound conditioning. From here, we move on to sensory versus emotional US nodes. So the expanded version of SOP is also called ASOP, which stands for the effective extension of SOP. And this assumes that a US presentation actually activates the two nodes. So a sensory node corresponds to the stimulus specific sensory qualities, and the emotive node corresponds to its affective qualities. We move on to elemental versus configural CS nodes. And during this, we have external inhibition, which is the weakening of a conditioned response elicited by a conditional stimulus when a neutral stimulus is added. And this moves on to relate to generalization decrement, which is a decrease in the transfer of a learned response from one stimulus to another, which is generalization, if the two stimuli are made to be different. So we are introduced to a couple of important people, such as Peirce-Hall model, and his approach is the configural theory, which assumes that when organisms receive classical conditioning with a compound conditional stimulus, they associate the entire compound with the unconditional stimulus rather than forming separate associations between each of its elements and the unconditional stimulus. So, in contrast of this theory, we have elemental theories, which assumes that when organisms receive conditioning with a compound conditional stimulus, they associate each element of the compound separately with the unconditional stimulus. So, in his model, he stated very many new predictions, and when presenting alone or combined the CS, he has examples of positive training and negative training. So positive training is when a procedure takes place in classical conditioning and two conditional stimuli are presented with the unconditional stimulus, which is classical conditioning. But when they are presented without the unconditional stimulus, they are presented alone. And the opposite of positive patterning is negative patterning, which is when in classical conditioning, a procedure in which two conditioned stimuli are paired with an unconditional stimulus when they are presented alone, but this occurs without the unconditioned stimulus when they are combined. And this is quite difficult for an elemental theory to explain why organisms can respond accordingly. So it goes back to Peirce's configural theory.